3 Chinese destroyers tore through the blood-red dawn fog, rushing at full speed from the northeast, shining steel bows heading straight into the formation of Vietnamese frigates, patrolling around Subi Reef. The terrifying screech of metal tore through the air. The starboard side of one Vietnamese ship was ripped open for over 10 meters. Water sprayed out profusely. In an instant, 3 other ships were also knocked off course, experiencing severely. Sailors tumbled across the wet deck. In just the first 10 minutes, 12 ships on both sides were heavily damaged. 2 Chinese destroyers had hull breaches. One Vietnamese frigate's radar mast was snapped in half. Thick black smoke billowed amidst level 5 waves. The Truong Sa Si at dawn was dyed red by the newly emerging sun and by the first oil slicks. The northeast wind blew strongly. 3-meter-high waves struck the shaking hull. Salt spray splashed onto the bridge windows. The artificial islands and reefs lay absolutely still, surrounded by the warships. Searchlights swept across the blood-red water surface, and before they could be turned off, they were consumed by the combat fire. Immediately, the main naval gun on the Chinese destroyer roared. The first volley tore through the wind and rushed toward the Vietnamese command ship. Less than 2 nautical miles away, the hull was ripped open. Fire flared in the auxiliary magazine, causing a black smoke column over 100 meters high. The Vietnamese frigate immediately retaliated. The first cruise missile rushed from the launcher, leaving a fierce orange fire trail in the dawn, striking directly the radar mast of the enemy's leading destroyer. The secondary explosion snapped the radar mast in half, splashing into the sea. At the same team, south of Gavin Reef, 2 Vietnamese high-speed patrol boats cut across the bow of a Chinese landing ship attempting to cross the barrier, colliding violently, causing both to spin. The propellers of the Vietnamese boats ripped off. Water flooded the engine compartment thunderously. An armed helicopter from the Chinese landing ship took off urgently, rotor blades cutting the red fog. Dropping rockets onto the deck of the recently rammed Vietnamese ship, the chain explosion sent sailors flying into the air, then falling onto the violently boiling sea surface. In the eastern sky, radar crews on both sides simultaneously raised the alarm. Over 10 fighter jets from the mainland and aircraft carriers rushed in, jet engines roaring, drowning out the sound of crashing waves. The first air-to-ship missile had left the pylon, drawing a bright white curve in the blood-red dawn, aiming straight for the ship staggering amidst the ramming vortex. Tropical rain poured down like a deluge. Visibility shrank to less than 1 nautical mile. The Truong Sa Si turned into a gray screen, with only the roaring of engines and the sound of clashing metal remaining. The 2 fleets entangled into a colossal Z-shape, one ship's bow ramming the side of another, then violently bouncing back with a terrifying screech. White water sprayed higher than the mast. A large Chinese landing ship rushed at full speed, attempting to breach the southern barrier near Subi Reef. A Vietnamese high-speed patrol boat, operating at half power, still stubbornly cut across, its steel bow ramming directly into the enemy's troop compartment, ripping open the port side for over 20 meters. Chinese landing troops lining up on deck were flung into the air, dozens falling straight into the pouring rain sea. At the same team, another Vietnamese frigate rushed in from the other side, ramming the bow straight into the ship that had just been hit, creating a 3-ship chain collision. An explosion rang out like thunder in the rain. 3 hulls jammed tightly together, drifted in the strong current. Meanwhile, in the center of the formation, a Chinese destroyer turned hard left rudder, using its entire 5,000-ton weight to ram the side of a severely damaged Vietnamese frigate. The Vietnamese ship's deck listed more than 40 degrees. Water rushed violently through the breach. Sailors desperately clung to the slippery railings. Screaming was drowned out by the rain. The secondary naval gun on the Chinese destroyer immediately fired rounds at close range. Armor-piercing rounds penetrated the Vietnamese frigate's engine compartment. Fire flared up, fiercely red through the white sheet of rain. At the same team, north of Mischief Reef, 2 Vietnamese frigates coordinated a parallel rush, cutting off the bow of a Chinese destroyer attempting to circle behind. The double collision dented the Chinese destroyer's bow. The main radar snapped in half. While the two Vietnamese ships also bounced back, missile launchers were bent and broken. Black smoke poured out, mixing with the rain. Armed helicopters on both sides took off in the pouring rain. Rotor blades whipped water everywhere. Volley rockets drew fire lines horizontally across the curtain of rain, exploding on the enemy ship decks into orange fire columns. Immediately extinguished by the rain, beneath the sea surface, a Vietnamese submarine silently closed in. Torpedo tubes already open, waiting for the moment. The two fleets were tightly jammed together to strike the fatal blow amidst the murky rainstorm. The fierce midday sun suddenly pierced the layer of rain, clouds, turning the Truong Sa-Sea surface into a glittering mirror of fire. Black smoke from 12 damaged ships billowed high, obscuring the 5 main reefs: Subi, Mischief, Hughes, Gavin, and Fiery Cross. The temperature on deck exceeded 40 degrees. The air was scorching hot with the smell of burnt oil and gunpowder. Sailors from both sides sweated blood onto the searing, hot steel deck. In the southern sky, over 30 fighter jets from both sides rushed into each other like a disturbed hornet's nest. Air-to-air missiles drew shimmering white streaks under the sun, exploding into orange fireballs in midair, debris falling into the sea with continuous splashing sounds. A Vietnamese fighter jet was hit, spinning and plunging straight onto the deck of the heavily damaged Chinese landing ship. The secondary explosion ripped apart the troop compartment, incinerating over 100 landing troops instantly. At the same team, north of Subi Reef, a Vietnamese armed helicopter squadron flew low close to the water surface, rotor blades whipping waves into white foam, continuously firing rockets at the Chinese destroyers attempting to tow their comrades' wreck. Each rocket volley struck the deck, creating fire columns over 10 meters high. Enemy sailors ran in panic under the scorching sun, splashing into the oil-slicked, burning sea. Meanwhile, in the center of the formation, a Chinese bomber from a distant aircraft carrier rushed in, dropping guided bombs onto the clustered, jammed Vietnamese ships. Bombs fell precisely through the layer of black smoke, penetrating the deck of the Vietnamese command ship, exploding the auxiliary magazine, causing a fire column over 100 meters high to erupt like a volcano at sea. The shock wave flung dozens of sailors into the air, then falling on to the violently boiling sea surface. Beneath the sea surface to the east, a Vietnamese submarine remained silent, waiting for its chance, sonar clearly detecting the chaotic propeller sounds of over 10 damaged hulls, drifting in a cluster under the scorching sunday. On the decks of the burning ships, the surviving gun crews attempted to pull the last naval gun, firing tracer rounds, drawing fiercely red curves under the sun, firing back at the armed helicopters circling low above the water like a swarm of hunting crows. The fiercely red sunset poured down onto the Truong Sa-Sea. Like thin, fresh blood on the water surface, the strong northeast monsoon wind blew at level 7, 4-meter-high waves struck the swaying hulls, causing them to let out long, mournful screeches. Black smoke from 12 damaged ships mingled with the twilight glow, forming a dark red curtain, obscuring all 5 reefs and turning the entire battlefield into a colossal furnace in the ocean. Suddenly, from a depth of 30 meters beneath the sea surface west of Fiery Cross Reef, 2 Vietnamese submarines simultaneously surfaced amidst the enemy formation like 2 black ghosts. Torpedo tubes opened wide, 4 heavy torpedoes rushed out, less than 500 meters from the target. Terrifying explosions rang out continuously underwater. 1 Chinese destroyer was ripped in half from mid-hull. The 2 halves flipped up onto the wave's surface, then sank vertically within 15 seconds. A water column over 50 meters high dyed the sunset red. At the same team, east of Mischief Reef, the most intact Chinese destroyer rotated its 130mm main gun, firing intensely at the heavily damaged Vietnamese command ship. Each armor-piercing shell whistled through the blood-red air. Penetrating the command compartment, fire flared up, consuming the operations room. Glass shattered violently. Officers on the command bridge were flung out of their seats amidst the long screeching of metal. Meanwhile, in the center of the formation, a Vietnamese armed helicopter flew low amidst the squall, dropping rockets onto the deck of the Chinese landing ship just damaged by the torpedo. Each rocket striking the armored vehicle compartment caused a chain reaction, fire spread into a fiercely red sea of fire under the sunset. Hundreds of landing troops jumped into the sea, boiling from burning oil. Beneath the sea surface to the south, a Chinese submarine retaliated with a volley of guided torpedoes. One missile rushed past and hit a Vietnamese frigate attempting to tow a comrade's ship. The hull was ripped in half. Water rushed violently in. Sailors clung to life rafts amidst fierce waves and fire. In the northern sky, radar crews on both sides simultaneously raised the alarm. Over 20 new fighter jets rushed in from the mainland, jet engines roaring, overpowering the sound of the monsoon wind, preparing for the first night airstrike amidst the blood-red sunset. Pitch-black night descended upon Truong Sa, like a steel curtain, with only bright red tracer streaks remaining, and white searchlights erratically sweeping the oil-burning sea surface. The monsoon wind still whistled at level 6. 3-meter-high waves struck the 12 heavily damaged hulls, causing them to collide with each other in long intervals, like the cry of wounded monsters. No radar was functioning, no more remote comment. Only the hoarse sound of struggling engines remained, and the groaning of metal in the darkness. From the still-afloat Vietnamese high-speed transport ship, over 400 assault troops leaped onto the deck of the Chinese frigate with the disabled engine, less than 50 meters away. They slid down ropes in the darkness, landing on the scorching hot steel deck. Silenced pistols fired intermittently. Smoke grenades erupted, covering the corridor in white smoke. Close combat erupted on the wet deck. Bayonets clashed, sparking fire. The sound of clashing metal drowned out the sound of the waves. Blood spread red under the flickering searchlights. At the same team, south of Gaven Reef, Chinese special forces descended from 3 armed helicopters. Rotor blades whipped the air, thick with the smell of burning oil. They fast roped down onto the deck of the Vietnamese patrol boat, listing more than 30 degrees, throwing fragmentation grenades into the engine compartment where fire was still flickering. A terrifying secondary explosion rang out, ripping apart half of the ship's hull. Surviving Vietnamese sailors rushed out of the hole, clinging to slippery railings in the pitch-black night, returning fire with rifles. While enemy helicopters circled right overhead, flare rockets illuminated the entire sea area into fierce red daylight. Meanwhile, in the center of the damaged ship cluster, 2 destroyers, 1 Vietnamese and 1 Chinese, were tightly jammed side by side, since the ramming now becoming a colossal fighting platform. Soldiers from both sides poured across makeshift planks, daggers flashed under the tracer light, screaming mixed with the hoarse sound of struggling engines and the roar of crashing waves. A Vietnamese machine gun on a still intact turret fired heavily, mowing down dozens of Chinese soldiers attempting to swarm across, bodies falling into the gap between the 2 hulls, then immediately swept away by the waves. Beneath the sea surface, both submarines remained in absolute silence. Torpedo tubes opened. Waiting for the exact moment, the 2 close combat teams were tightly stuck together to strike the final blow in the starless, black night. Thick fog covered Truong Sa at dawn on the second day, turning the sea surface into a white graveyard, with only the sound of rattling respirators remaining, and the groaning of metal from 12 heavily damaged wrecks, drifting as a colossal cluster amidst the 5 reefs. The temperature dropped below 20 degrees. The cold penetrated through the layer of cooled, burnt oil, causing sailors on both sides to shiver violently on the slippery deck. The cluster of 12 ships jammed together like a floating iron island, becoming a living target in the fog. From the east, 4 new Chinese destroyers rushed in at full speed, their shining steel bows cutting through the fog screen, determined to salvage their comrades' wrecks. Simultaneously from the west, 3 intact Vietnamese frigates also tore through the fog, rushing in, the 2 new formations rushing straight into the wreckage cluster to vie for every damaged hull. Collisions rang out continuously in the white fog. 1 Chinese destroyer rammed the side of the newly arrived Vietnamese frigate, Ripping open the starboard side for over 30 meters, white water sprayed out, mixing with the fog. The Vietnamese frigate retaliated by turning hard right rudder, ramming the boat back into the enemy's engine compartment. The two hulls jammed tightly together again, engines roaring uselessly in the chilling cold fog. At the same time, in the center of the wreckage cluster, assault troops from both sides were still engaged in close combat on the makeshift iron bridges. Silenced pistol fire crackled intermittently in the fog, bayonet flash, creating faint sparks. Bodies fell into the gap between the ship hulls, then vanished into the thick fog layer. Armed helicopters from both sides broke low, rotor blades sweeping the fog into white vortices, dropping flares onto the ship cluster, causing fire to flare up fiercely red again, piercing the fog screen like ghostly torches. Beneath the sea surface, a Vietnamese submarine silently closed in on the wreckage cluster, sonar clearly detecting the chaotic propeller sounds of the newly arrived ships, torpedo tubes already open, only waiting for a command to turn the entire floating iron island into a sunken tomb amidst the chilling fog of the second dawn. The midday sun, scorching the skin, flared up like a colossal furnace, dispersing the fog in just a few minutes, revealing the cluster of 12 heavily damaged wrecks, drifting as a floating island of scorched iron in the Truong Sa Sea. Burning oil slicks spread across the water surface for over 30 nautical miles. Thick black smoke billowed thousands of meters high, turning the air into a steam furnace mixed with gunpowder. Sailors from both sides gasped as if suffocating. From the northeast, a squadron of Chinese bomber planes rushed in, above the wreckage cluster, dropping anti-armor cluster bombs onto the Vietnamese ships, attempting to tow their comrades' ship. Hundreds of bomblets scattered in the glaring sun, raining down like iron rain onto the deck of the Vietnamese frigate, penetrating the thin steel layer, exploding the auxiliary fuel tank, causing fire columns over 50 meters high to flare up. Sailors ran in panic on the scorching hot deck, splashing into the boiling, burning, oil-slick sea. At the same time, in the southwest, the most intact Vietnamese frigate launched its final volley of cruise missiles. 6 missiles rushed through the harsh sunlight, aiming straight for the Chinese aircraft carrier over 100 nautical miles away. They flew low just above the water's surface, piercing the thick layer of black smoke, striking the flight deck. The chain explosion ripped apart the carrier's deck. Fire spread into a fiercely red sea of fire under the midday sun. Dozens of fighter jets on the deck were incinerated before they could take off. Meanwhile, in the center of the wreckage cluster, armed helicopters from both sides rushed into each other amidst the fire. Rotor blades whipped smoke into black and red vortices. Volley rockets drew fire streaks horizontally across the sunlight, exploding on the ship decks, sending red-hot steel fragments flying everywhere, penetrating the enemy ship hulls like a rain of knives. Surviving assault troops on the makeshift iron bridges sniped at each other. Through the thick smoke layer, bright red tracer rounds drew curves under the scorching sun, bodies falling into the burning, oil-slicked sea, creating horrifying, sizzling sounds. Beneath the sea surface, the Vietnamese submarine remained in absolute silence. Torpedo tubes already open, waiting for the exact moment the Chinese aircraft carrier was burning, and listing violently to strike the fatal blow. Amidst the scorching midday Sunday, a level 8 storm suddenly struck from the south, wind gusts exceeding 100 knots. 6-meter-high waves struck the cluster of 12 wrecks like colossal sledgehammer. The Truong Sa Sea surface turned into black, murky mountain ranges of water. Burning oil slicks were whipped by the wind into showers of fiercely red fire, falling onto the ship decks. The heavily damaged ship hulls began to sink gradually. The bow of a Chinese destroyer rose high, then slid vertically down. The stern of a Vietnamese frigate flipped up to the sky before being swallowed by the wave in an instant. Amidst the storm, rescue helicopters from both sides plunged into the wreckage cluster, both to drop rescue lines and to shoot at each other. The Vietnamese transport helicopter hovered low amidst the squalls. Rescue lines whipped wildly. Rescue personnel slid down onto the deck of the Chinese ship, listing more than 60 degrees. both pulling up enemy sailors and being heavily fired upon by rockets from Chinese armed helicopters. A Vietnamese helicopter was flung away by the wind. Its rotor blades struck the mast of the Chinese landing ship, exploding into a fireball, falling straight into the storm-tossed sea. High waves swallowed the debris in an instant. At the same time, east of the ship cluster, a Chinese rescue tug rushed in amidst the fierce waves, attempting to secure a line to a sinking comrade's destroyer. A still afloat Vietnamese frigate rushed across, cutting its path, its bow ramming straight into the cable, ripping the tow cable apart, causing the Chinese destroyer to sink faster. Hundreds of sailors splashed into the storm-tossed sea, clinging to life rafts amidst water columns over 10 meters high. Meanwhile, in the center of the storm, two frigates, one Vietnamese and one Chinese, were still tightly jammed side by side since the first day, now being lifted and smashed down by the waves like a crushing hammer. Surviving soldiers on deck clung tightly to the railings, both shooting at each other and watching the hull screech in long intervals. Before the steel side ripped apart, water rushed violently through the gap wider than 5 meters. A final naval gun on the Vietnamese ship was still able to rotate, firing the last volley of shells into the Chinese ship's engine compartment, exploding and blowing apart half of the enemy ship's hull. Fiercely red fire flared up, whipped by the storm, whined into showers of fire falling onto the sea. Beneath the raging sea, both submarines dove deeper than 100 meters. In absolute silence, only the echoing sound of sonar remaining like a cry in the hell of the storm. Dawn on the third day was suddenly silent as death. The storm suddenly dissipated. The wind completely died down. Waves were only gentle ripples, as if there had never been a storm. The vast Truong Sa Sea surface became unsettlingly flat, with only thin black smoke hovering low over the charred shipwrecks, and oil slicks stretching for dozens of nautical miles. Of the 12 heavily damaged hulls, only 7 now floated adrift, half submerged, half afloat, masts broken, decks tilting. Not a single searchlight remained lit. From the east, a Chinese rescue tug slowly moved in, without a war flag, only hoisting a large white flag. From the west, a Vietnamese hospital ship also silently closed in. The loudspeaker transmitted the same brief message in English: ceasefire for rescue. Not a single shot was fired in return. Absolute silence prevailed. Only the gentle sound of water lapping against the steel hull remained, and the dry coughing of the survivors. Rescue helicopters from both sides circled low together, armored, dropping ropes onto the enemy ship decks. Vietnamese rescue personnel slid down onto the slowly sinking Chinese destroyer, pulling up individual enemy sailors, even though they were still wearing bloody uniforms. Conversely, Chinese personnel descended onto the Vietnamese frigate, carrying the severely wounded onto the helicopters. Without a word, only the sound of rattling respirators, and the sound of ropes whipping the wind. At the same team, in the center of the wreckage cluster, 2 rescue teams met on the iron bridge, connecting 2 nearly broken hulls. They stopped 3 meters apart, looking at each other through the still hovering smoke layer, then collectively bowed their heads and continued their work. No one fired, no one pushed the opponent into the sea. Only the sound of ropes pulling, the sound of life rafts being thrown into the water, and the sobbing of those who had just found their dead comrades. In the sky, over 20 reconnaissance aircraft from both sides circled in wide arcs, cameras continuously rolling, but not a single missile left the launcher. Radar crews on the remaining ships received clear orders. Hold fire until further notice. The Truong Sa Sea was silent as a cage, only the sound of rescue helicopter engines echoing faintly in the distant gray dawn. The final sunset descended upon the Truong Sa Sea, like a dark red and black curtain, dyeing the remaining oil slicks red, and the last smoke trails slowly dissipated in the gentle wind. The 7 remaining floating hulls were divided, or were slowly towed southwest by Vietnamese tugboats. 3 were towed northeast by Chinese tugboats. No more collisions, no more tracers, only the sound of taut cables, and the hoarse sound of diesel engines pulling the multi-thousand-ton steel skeletons toward two different horizons. On the decks of the wrecks about to disappear below the horizon, the last sailors were pulled up onto rescue helicopters from both sides. A Vietnamese rescue worker reached out to assist a severely wounded Chinese sailor, placing HI neatly on the helicopter floor, then silently nodded. The Chinese helicopter pilot returned a brief nod, pulling the stick to fly in the opposite direction. No words spoken, no hateful glances, only the sound of rotor blades fading away in the blood-red sunset. At the same team, in the center of the former combat zone, the five reefs, Subi, Mischief, Hughes, Gavin, and Fiery Cross, reappeared clearly in the twilight glow. No more searchlights sweeping, no more smoke columns, only the silent concrete structures stood still in the vast ocean. The final reconnaissance aircraft from both sides flew over one last team, their cameras slowly rolling before silently turning back to base. Not a single bomb fell, not a single shot was fired. Beneath the sea surface, both submarines were still deep, but the torpedo tubes were closed. Sonar only detected the sound of ship towing cables, and the sound of dolphins returning to swim amidst the slowly dissolving oil slim. When the sun touched the horizon line, the 7 final wrecks vanished at two opposite sides. The Truong Sa Sea returned to silence. Only the gentle sound of waves lightly hitting the submerged reefs remained, and the sound of wind whispering through the solitary concrete pillars. No one declared victory on the radio. No one fired a cannon to celebrate victory. Only 12 heavily damaged hulls remained, swallowed by the sea, in a vast area of water bearing a dark red scar that would take a long team to heal.